Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Pastor Kevin Brown here, Journey Ministries, also giving birth to On the Mound with Pastor Brown show. We are certainly thankful for God for your participation and support and continued support. Thank you for all of your thoughts, all your posts, all your prayers. Please go to that subscribe button, click subscribe, and share it with others as we continue to build our uh, team of supporters. We are looking for you to like our page and things of this nature. I want to start by way of introduction today to say first and foremost that most recently, obviously, the news media has demonstrated and shown us over the last 7 days and has reported and well chronicled the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Obviously, there have been many talk shows, there have been many interviews with all the specialists, and everyone wants to offer their own personal narrative as it relates to what the problems are. And let me say this as well. As a pastor, obviously, it puts us in a very unique space and place, and oftentimes that responsibility of articulating and standing for truth. Many times we have made concessions based upon our demographics. And I'm saying we, and I'm not just saying black pastors, I'm talking about all pastors that have subscribed to live a life in the vocation of shepherding people, God's people. Because when we consider that all of us, under the sound of my voice, those of you viewing in, based upon his unequivocal truth, have been created in his own image and likeness. And therefore, all of humanity belongs to God because God created each and every one of us. And when I say that, I'm also reminded that the most segregated day here is on Sunday. This is where we go to our various places of worship. And unfortunately, many of our places of worship, they are greatly segregated. Then we come back together when we have an episode or a thing. We'll share pulpits and we'll have songs of kumbaya. But when a rubber starts to meet the road, do our counterparts go back to their places of and to their congregations to talk to them about the ills of other groups, the ills of those that are going through oppression and poverty and all the various different things, or do they go and about business as usual? Well, I'm just kind of somewhat perturbed in the sense of inwardly saying enough is enough. And when I thought about this thought, I thought about a story that is found in the book of Nehemiah. In the first chapter, if I were to paraphrase it, the situation was happening where Nehemiah, who was a person that had been caught up in the exile of the Israelites, he is now in a place of prominence and a position of influence. He serves the king's court as the cupbearer. Nehemiah one day had some visitors come from his homeland, his brother, and Nehemiah asked a specific question about how things were going at home. And one of the things that I discovered from that particular lesson and story is that Nehemiah was greatly concerned about those. Even though he had been removed, even though he was in this prominent place and space of affluence, he did not forget about his own people. And that is further reinforced and authenticated because when Nehemiah asked the question, it demonstrated his sincerity that was reinforced by his response. He asked his brother how things were going, and when his brother told him that it's all bad, we are exposed, we're vulnerable, we're being exploited, we are dying, it moved him in a sense that he was greatly uh, overwhelmed with mourning to the extent that he wept, to the extent that he went to God in prayer. As I push the pause button right there, when you talk about this particular story of Nehemiah, I want to leverage and kind of draw some scenarios or some similarities as it relates to the African American plight. And even when you consider the fact of the 400 years of slavery, when you consider all the things leading up to integration, even prior to that, all the horrific um, events that people of color, Black people, have been subjected to. And I want us to understand that those behaviors, how people have um, and how people view people of color, has been a systemic narrative that started a long time ago when we start talking about colonization. Colonization that led to a constitution that depicted certain people, specifically African Americans, as less than human. In spite of the amendments, in spite of all these things, we have to understand that the Constitution was designed in a way that it already determined who the victor was. And the victor at that particular time was the white majority. And so when we look fast forward at the blueprint that was constructed, we have to understand that whether it be in the education system, when we see all the learning disabilities, and we see how marginalized communities underperform because of X, Y, Z, whether it be the financing system, when we start looking at credit scores, and we start looking at buying houses and vehicles and all these various different things, whether it be the justice system or the health system, all these things I call as ancillary elements within the system. The system in and of itself was designed to produce the disparities that we see today. And therefore, rather than working on the symptoms, we have to be more focused and discipline on dismantling the system that was created to produce the outcomes that we see today. Yes, I understand that many of us tout how, the Constitution is, how we govern and all of these things. But yet when you consider the architects of the Constitution, they were slave owners. When you consider that these individuals had come to a foreign land that had indigenous people and displaced and supplanted these people, and in essence just took over their land. And when I'm thinking about all these various different moving parts, it behooves me to suggest to this: Nehemiah heard about his people, and it caused him to take action. Now, I'll also say this, is that the actions that many people are taking, I may not agree with in its entirety. I don't agree with the looting, the small businesses, and the violence associated with some of the elements taking place. Now, we have had conversations for decades as it relates to the inclusion of African American, as it relates to the discrepancy of treatment for the African Americans, as it relates to how they are sentenced for the same crime as their white counterpart, even more severely. We're not talking about how, it's difficult to understand how a person is going to respond to hurt. Who am I to tell someone they're wrong for how they choose to exercise a gift called free will that I did not give them? Now, it may not be how I would choose to respond, right, to any given situation, but yet again, I have to allow the person the full autonomy to exercise a gift that I did not give them based upon their reality, based upon their interpretation of truth. I was born and raised in Oroville, California, which is northeast of Sacramento, about 1 hour. And Oroville, or Butte County, is a very unique place and space. Growing up there, I remember when I first started driving, that my father had purchased me a 1966 Ford Mustang, and I put the beat in there, and and so obviously it was a nice car. It was very colorful. It was a turquoise blue, and but I remember driving down Montgomery, and I was doing about 28 miles an hour, and because the speed limit was 25. And I remember Officer Hoffman sitting on his motorcycle, and he had his head down, and when he heard the music and I went by, he just started his motorcycle up and pulled me over and said I was speeding, doing 40 miles an hour, which was not true. Did not get the ticket because we had conversation, but more or less my being stopped did not stop with that particular episode, because a few weeks thereafter, Officer Brownie decided that he wanted to pull me over as well. And so what I'm saying is that from my own personal experiences and encounters, whether it be in high school, where I have experienced the stopping because I was black while driving, whether it be me going to the airport. This is back in the days at Sacramento when you could pull up to the curb and wait for your people, your guests. I remember one particular occasion I'd driven out there and was late. My friend was flying in from out of state rather, and I had on some shorts and didn't have my wallet or anything. And I come out and I was driving my car, convertible Corvette, and I remember coming out of the airport, and police officer was right there. He's running the numbers, running the ticket and all that, and he's saying, "Hey, this is not your car. This car belongs to Kevin Brown." I'm like, "I am Kevin Brown." And it just so happened that my friend happened to have a baseball card, and it showed the officer that I was who I said I was. Obviously, there's another Kevin Brown that he and I both were drafted in 1986 in the first round. He was drafted by the Texas Rangers, me the Atlanta Braves. I remember meeting him, and I'm digressing a little bit, meeting him in 1986 in West Palm Beach. We were having, it was called at that particular time, it was a prospect camp to where many of us with the Expos, their organization was there, the Texas Rangers were there, Atlanta Braves were there. And so, but anyway, Kevin and I met, but his real name, his first name is James Kevin, and I am Kevin Dwayne. So anyway, that episode at the airport is not uncommon, because that is par for the course. We just adopted it as being normal. We just adopted it as this is the way it's going to be for us. It doesn't matter how affluent that you may be. If you're a person of color, we have to recognize that we have to drive a certain way. We have to drive differently than our counterparts. We have to act differently because, unfortunately, the system that we live in always seems to allow privilege for people that aren't black, whereas privilege that they, when I say they, people that are white are afforded. It doesn't matter what their socioeconomic plight is, because of their skin color, they seem to have more benefits than people that look like me. Even in Major League sports, in professional sports. I remember years ago when LeBron was going to leave Cleveland for the first time, the owner, Dan Gilbert, vehemently reminded LeBron that he needed to get in his place, that he was just a field Negro that worked for him, and he was very disappointed that he was not succumbing and doing what his so-called master owner wanted him to do. this particular thought as it relates to racism. And let me give you a working definition of racism. Racism, from my perspective, is the ability, the wherewithal, the power, and the money and the political support to practice with a specific outcome and a predetermined outcome your prejudice. And so when we talk about, people being racist, it's hard for me to understand how someone can call a black person racist based upon that definition. Because when you consider black people, what do black people own? What political support and affluence and things of this nature can they practice their prejudice with a specific outcome? Well, racism today is alive and well. Racism is on the news, it's on the radio shows, it's these conversations that don't necessarily happen the way that they should happen. I was watching the news the other day, and I love Mr. Dyson. He is very articulate, very insightful as it relates to his ability to not only capture history, but to make it relevant as it is here in 2020. I'm here to say, as a pastor, I pastor a multiracial church, but yet on this journey, I'm hoping and praying that our brothers and sisters that worship here at Journey Ministry understand that when their brother or sister is hurting, that they would come alongside their brother and sister, not just in word, but in action. And the only action that we're taking here, first and foremost, is praying. I've heard the argument, well, why are you praying to a God that people gave you a religion and all these things? And I don't want to minimize the power of God, because when we start to put these self-imposed ceilings on the powerful God that created everything out of nothing and say, well, the only reason you're praying to a God that the white man gave you, and you need to go back to your heritage and all, I am of the opinion that God's power, yes, even throughout slavery, even throughout all those atrocities that have been enacted against people of color, that the God that created everything doesn't have any color, because he made everybody. And therefore, when we talk about praying, we're saying, God, I need your help. Which reminds me of the book of Exodus, when the Israelites were in Egyptian bondage for over 400 years. Moses, they prayed, and the situation never changed. Didn't change until it got time to change. As a matter of fact, it so happened that when they were emancipated, that the leadership of Moses and his brother Aaron were all under the guidance and direction of God. I don't know where we're at today as it relates to moving this conversation forward, especially here in Sacramento, when I just flashed on the news and I saw that our basketball TV commentator had been exposed for some of his racial comments. And one of the things that is very disheartening is that typically people feel very emboldened because of President Trump and how he has been allowed to get say and do whatever he wants to do without being held accountable. And people in these little sects feel that they can do the same thing. And it does not surprise me, especially when you hear of the Grant Napiers that are now being suspended, right, because of some Twitter comments. But more importantly, ownership allowed that, knowing who this individual has been and has demonstrated. Because when you look and interview the players that have been with the organization in his tenure since '97, many of them will tell you that, well, he's a closet racist. He's a closet bigot, and it's unfortunate, but it is what it is. And we have to stop denying the truth. My mother would tell me a long time ago, she said, son, if somebody demonstrates and shows you that they're crazy, believe them the first time. You see, we keep wanting to give people passes, but this is a time and place and space to where there's no more passes. Right is right and wrong is wrong. And I speak to those owners, right, that sit there and make millions and billions of dollars off the backs of these black poor athletes that now come into their millions upon millions of dollars, but yet we still don't have any ownership. Until we can start to have people that look like me sitting around the table as decision makers with the ability to make decisions for constructive change, we will continue to have and witness what we witness. Even 6 years ago, when Michael Brown was killed, I flew out there with Sacramento Act and Pico National. Les Simmons, myself, and Ashley Maloof, who was the executive director at that particular time. And participating in that particular protest illuminated and helped scales from my eyes remove, because in Ferguson, which is only about 2 miles from St. Louis, where it was all peace and tranquility, but yet in this place of Ferguson, you saw the atrocities being enacted against the African Americans. Then I had to remind myself, well, Missouri was one of the last states to abolish slavery. So what are you thinking when you consider the fact that this whole country was established and that the well was built upon the slaves of black people? It does not surprise me that at this point in period in time that we are at a tipping point. People are tired. People are tired of the same old, same old. And I'm not just saying this to white America, but I'm saying this also to black America, to those affluent, to those that have the ability to do some things, to be part of change, from the youngest to the oldest. I'm talking about elected officials here in Sacramento. I'm talking to those persons of color that sit here and have sat at the dais and made these profound statements, but your actions aren't consistent to what you're saying. You see, when you consider some of the zip codes and where Sacramento is greatly impoverished, and we have people of color that are the council people, that's a problem. You know, unfortunately, the system in and of itself has coronated and anointed certain people to be representatives of Black America. But you see, they are disinterested in moving this thing forward. Disinterested in the sense of that they roll their sleeves up, that they put their neck on the line, that they use their own money to help stimulate and fund things, that they are against things, right? Legalizing marijuana, having marijuana dispensaries overly populated in your district, knowing that the number one users of these products are going to be people of color that now can't get no jobs because they can't urinate clean, and therefore it's. But yet we keep pushing this along. I want to close by telling you a story. Years ago, there was two separate kingdoms. One of the kingdoms came up with this idea. Let us create a machine that will take all of our bad feelings and melancholy feelings and depression and anxiety and angst, and let us make a machine that will take and process those feelings and produce happy feelings. Well, you know what? That machine was working. But yet the one challenge in this machine was that it produced dross as its discharge. And so the happy kingdom people that have this happiness machine that are now happy all the time allow their discharge to be placed in the river. that eventually washes up on the shores of that distant kingdom. And eventually, that distant kingdom, because of the dross washing up on its shores, became very unhappy. Unhappy because of the stench that was associated with the discharge. And eventually, when it continued to accumulate on the shores and started going into their places of habitation, the people started to protest. And rather than listening with the intent to comply, with the intent to have a level of empathy, the happy kingdom people said, let us build a larger machine so that we can drown out the voice of those detractors. So they built an even larger machine. Now this machine is pumping out discharge and dross and just washing and overwhelming and decimating kingdom number two. These protesters took to the streets. And now there was a certain segment from the happy kingdom people that started to empathize with the protesters and said, oh, my happiness is causing you unhappiness. Let me see what I can do to reconcile this process. And so forth. And so as they started to collaborate with kingdom number two, that segment, that small remnant of people that now wanted to come and align themselves because they realized that they were part of the problem. Their happiness was their top priority. They didn't care about anyone else other than themselves. But when they were awakened that their happiness was impacting another group of people, and that other group of people were greatly unhappy, they aligned themselves with them and they started to organize and protest and do all these various different things. And so the happy kingdom people felt that the only way that they could shut this down was to meet this protest with a strong resistance. You see, the happiness machine would be what I would classify the Constitution of the United States, that was designed to produce and promote the happiness of the white majority, whereas the dross that this machine produced was for kingdom number two, primarily African Americans. When you consider the plight of people, when you consider this machine, the machine in and of itself needs to be systematically dismantled and replaced with something that is going to create space of neutrality for all of us to live out our God-intended purpose, to live out our God-intended creation, because God created all of us in His image, in His likeness. And it's our responsibility to make certain that we have a space and place for everyone. The last thing I will say is that my grandchildren, my two oldest grandchildren, they are biracial. They are Armenian and they are African American. And they are 11 and 12 years old, and they are witnessing all these things. And it has created many stimulating conversations that I use as a teachable moment. They have actually shared with me how their Armenian cousins that are full Armenian have called them the N-word in their times of playing, and when things don't go right in the game, then they yell things out. Well, my grandson was called a nigger on 2 occasions by his Armenian cousin, all over a game. But you see, the challenge with that is that who gives him permission, and why would he even think that that was even possible? We need to recognize that racism and prejudice is taught. And we as adults, we in places and spaces of leadership, especially in our homes, need to start right there. Thank you, and God continue to keep you safe.